Hello friends, so today's video is going to be the perfect book challenge. If you've never seen this, the idea is that you take a bunch of the components that make up books and then you assign a specific book that you think does every individual component really well. So for example, if you really like the humor in Joe Abercrombie's works, then you would list his, let's say, First Law trilogy as the one that you would pick for that, and then you like the magic of Brandon Sanderson. And so you're essentially trying to pick pieces of all your favorite books until you have the perfect book. So I wanted to do a refresh to do this challenge again, but specifically only being able to answer with new releases from 2022. I thought it'd be a fun way to kind of give an overview of a lot of the new releases from this last year, especially because this way, if you are a character-driven reader, if you're somebody who likes the writing specifically, if you're somebody who likes the action or the plot, whatever book I list for those individual categories, maybe that will signal, oh, okay, well, maybe that book is for me because that's what I like. So anyway, I just thought this could be fun, but also maybe helpful for you. I also added a few more categories into this, so I'm actually going to be able to include even more books. And to make it especially challenging, I am not allowed to have any repeats. I have to have different books for every single prompt. And for some of them, I decided to have multiple books for that same prompt, but I never have repeats. So anyway, jumping into it, the first prompt is the prose. I have my notes right over there, so if you see me looking over there, that's what I'm looking at. So for this one, I will say really quick that I'm including both young adult and adult fantasy. And what's tough is there's a lot of them that did prose well, but I also thought some of the ones that did prose well did other things really well too. So I decided to go with The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea. The writing in this is not necessarily purple prose, but it is very lyrical and very pretty, but very approachable. And that's one of my favorite styles of writing. It's one of my favorite kinds of prose because it makes, within a fantasy world, it makes it so that you don't feel like, wait a second, is that actually happening? Or is that just like a really pretty metaphor? And The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea is not necessarily a complicated fantasy story. It's not like The Goblin Emperor or something, but still, when it comes to fantasy, I typically want to make sure that I'm really understanding everything, that I have my feet pretty firmly on the ground, or if the world is complex, that I'm not then trying to learn about the world through a super intricate lens, because then it just makes it harder to feel like I know exactly what's going on. Other genres, I think maybe writing, whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm going off on a tangent. I'm also going to include, and this wasn't one of my favorite reads of 2022, but I'm also going to include Gallant. I know this wasn't a lot of other people's favorites either, but the reason I'm including it is because in a very short amount of time, V.E. Schwab was able to establish a very eerie aesthetic and an eerie vibe to the story, and she did it through the prose. So I wanted to kind of include that as well. Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea is still the main answer for this one, but Gallant did establish itself very well through its writing. Next up, we have world building. I'm going to approach this one the same way, where I have my main answer and then kind of a option B answer. So main answer, no one's going to be surprised, I'm sure. I have Engines of Empire. I loved Engines of Empire. I want more people to read it. I think it's a fantastic start to an epic fantasy. I over and over and over again describe it as Final Fantasy XII meets Game of Thrones. So you can imagine that that's going to be a pretty cool world. And I definitely felt like the way in which the world was being delivered to me, it felt like it was a sense of discovery for a lot of the characters because it is a multiple perspective story. So the characters are starting to learn more about these other places that they go to. And so then therefore you are learning alongside them. And then there's one character who is more involved with the politics, and that character is familiar with the political landscape, which I like because then that means, okay, well, they're familiar with it, and so I'm kind of being clued in on things with them, but then the actual literal world itself, like the physical settings, the other characters are learning about those places as they go there. So I just felt like the way the world building was delivered was really cool, exceptionally done. The other one I'm mentioning is City of Dusk. I wouldn't say the way that the world building was delivered was my favorite, but I thought the world was interesting, and it was quite an endeavor for this author because there's multiple different magic systems. So you have a lot of different perspectives, and a lot of the perspectives have different magic systems, and they live in different areas where the cultures are kind of based off of whatever god or goddess they worship, and then that god or goddess has their own magic system tied to them, and that plays a role, like I said, in the culture and their customs and things like that. And so it was a lot to take in, and like I said, it wasn't delivered in my absolute favorite way, but still I thought it was quite impressive, and it was so vast that I just wanted to mention it here because I thought it was worth noting. Speaking of magic, next up we have magic system. So first I gotta say, a magic steeped in poison. This magic system has to do with tea, and I thought it was so creative and so interesting and so unique. So our main character is somebody who uses the art of tea making to kind of, it's hard to explain, but it's almost like they reach this spiritual realm in which they can kind of connect with people. It's not like they go and talk to people who have passed on necessarily. It's like they're able to communicate with individuals with whom they are surrounded by, and they can connect with them in a way that they might not necessarily be able to otherwise. And there's a whole lot of other things you can do as well. And part of it has to do with the fact that the tea leaves themselves come from the earth, and then the water obviously comes from the water of the planet. And so it kind of grounds you, and it allows you to have this power that is pulled from the earth itself. And I just thought it was all really creative. And then the next one I'm going to mention for the same category, sorry, like I said, I have a lot of ones where I just couldn't pick one, but I really liked the magic in Babel. I feel like because there's so little fantastical elements to Babel that people often, in talking about it, they talk about so many other aspects of it, because those other aspects are, of course, the main focus. The main focus of Babel is not the magic system. But I thought the magic was really interesting. It has to do with language, and then you have to have a certain fluency with that language. And then you write certain words on silver, and then there's like another piece of silver that is almost like a twin to it. And so silver will have certain abilities based off of the word that's been put on it. And then its twin, you have to update the twin to keep the other one strong, we'll say. It's almost like a battery. Like if you update the twin, then it makes the other one, charge back up again to some degree. That is not the best way to explain that magic system, but it's kind of loosely the idea. And I just thought it was really interesting and really creative. And I thought it was a great way for R.F. Kuang to incorporate her expertise with language within the magic itself. After that, we have characters. Bizarrely, this was the hardest one for me to decide on. I'm such a character-driven reader, and when you can really give me characters that I absolutely love, I will probably love that book. But I found I wasn't loving a ton of the characters that I was coming across in the new fantasy this year. And then I remembered that Fury Song came out, and I was like, well, that one is going to win for this category. So it's the third and final book in the Aurelian cycle. So, I had 2 other books to get to know these characters. But that doesn't diminish the fact that I love these characters. I love the way that Rosario Munda wrote their struggles, the trauma that they've gone through and how it affects them in present day, the resilience, especially. There's one character in particular in Fury Song that is just kind of solidified. It's one of my favorite characters of all time. The way they are able to persevere through terrible circumstances, the way they press on, they care so much about their society, about their friends, about just people in general, and trying to establish a better future. I loved that character so much. So Fury Song wins for characters. Next up we have plot, and I think I gotta go with Ruination for plot, because I can remember the characters and I found them rather distinct. They were established with their motivations and their struggles and their personalities pretty quickly. but it wasn't necessarily the characters that kept me wanting to turn the page. It was really just like, what's going to happen next? And so I think it's kind of a classic plot-driven story. Yeah, I don't know. I just really liked the plot in Ruination. Next up, we have action and battle. This one was actually kind of easy. Art of Prophecy. I really liked the action in this. I could visualize it really well. I think that the author has experience in being a stunt double, so I think that he put that experience really well into the writing of the action because it felt like I was watching a movie. I could see everything very clearly, so Art of Prophecy wins for action. Next up, we have humor. T. Kingfisher, absolutely. I loved her writing. I constantly found myself chuckling or smirking or just kind of being like, nice, while I was reading. And her humor is not going to be for everyone, and her humor is different from book to book. I think it's a little bit more subtle and kind of dry in something like Nettle and Bone. And then in A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking, it's much more in your face and very silly and very over the top, but it's a lot of fun. So I think T. Kingfisher, but I also wanted to include If You Could See the Sun, because I found this one quite amusing as well. I think that the voice the author gave the character made some of the heavier topics in this one a little bit more amusing, like it was poking fun at itself. And the book is a little bizarre, and you kind of just have to roll with it because its premise is a little unbelievable. But it's like it knows it, and it just kind of is like, we're just going to have people accept the fact that this girl can turn invisible. It's our own world. That's the only fantasy part. The girl randomly one day turns invisible, and then she goes to tell someone about it, and they just accept it basically immediately. And you're like, okay, I guess that's what we're doing here. But it didn't bother me because it didn't seem like it was taking itself really seriously, even though it was approaching some serious topic. After that, we have romance. So this is where I brought in a new category. I decided to do romance spice and then romance sweet, because it's different kind of romance. Romance spice is obviously like the tension, the will they, won't they, whereas romance sweet is just, I don't have to explain it to you. You understand the difference. So romance spice, I went ahead and put The Bridge Kingdom. Technically the third book is the new release from this year, but I think that the author balances pretty well the tension between characters and the plot, because the quickest way to ruin the spice in a book for me is if the characters are like, the world is basically ending, but let's bang right now. And I'm just like, ugh, how? Why? Like, right now? Ugh. And I just end up thinking the characters are stupid. So you gotta make it believable, you know? And I think that that series does that pretty well. For romance sweet, I couldn't pick one, so I have several. I have Half a Soul, because that is just such a charming, delightful, sweet story. And there's some banter between the characters, and it's just adorable. This very secret society of irregular witches, I constantly described as being sweet and adorable. It's extra precious. I really liked the couple in this. And then Master of Iron. This is a sequel, and I just thought the way that the characters interacted with each other was very sweet, especially because the main character in Master of Iron and its first book, The Blade of Secrets, she is somebody who has a lot of anxiety, and I liked that the main character, it wasn't like her love interest was trying to fix her or love her in spite of. It was very much a matter of, well, this is a part of who you are, and I love who you are, and so I want to do what I can to be there for you. And I just thought that was really, really sweet. My dog is laying right next to me, and she just started snoring. So if you end up hearing little cute noises, it's her. Sweet little angel puff. So cute. Next two categories would be hero and villain. I, in one sense, am kind of combining these two. I'm smushing them together to answer. And then separately, just talking about villains, I have a different answer. So just talking about villains, I'm going to say Hunger of the Gods. You get two new perspectives in this sequel, and both of them are antagonistic perspectives. One in particular is a sniveling, blech, I hate this guy kind of a character, but at the same time, being in his head is kind of interesting, and the way that John Gwynne wrote him reminded me a little bit of Glokta, except for I feel like Glokta, everybody like kind of, not everyone, but a lot of people secretly kind of relate to, whereas this other guy, he's just awful, but he's also kind of just slimy, and you don't probably relate to him. He's very full of himself. But it was interesting being in his head. And then, like I said, for hero, I kind of have to combine it with villain for this next answer, and that would be KKE. So the reason that I'm thinking of this in a bizarre, smushed way is because this character is one that, in some ways, by the end, some people view her as the villain. But at the same time, I think this entire book is examining this individual that we've seen in a story before, or at least I haven't, but she has been in a story before, and she has been seen as this villainous individual. But the whole purpose of KKE is, let's actually really focus in on her side of the story. And when you focus in on her side of the story, in some ways she is a hero. And what I like is that she's a flawed individual, but she is an individual who ultimately wants for the good of others, for the good of her family, and she puts everything into that. But sometimes in putting her all into something, it can kind of swing in the wrong direction than what she was hoping, and sometimes things happen in spite of what she's doing and in spite of her efforts. And so I really thought the way that the author examines this character was done really well. The last few are the other additional ones that I added, so I decided to add descriptions. A little different than world building, because it's specifically how the things are brought to you, how you're able to visualize them. So for descriptions, I have a couple. Daughter of the Moon Goddess. I think that the descriptions are one of my favorite parts of this story, because I just thought the world just seemed so lush and pretty, and how the author described things, everything was so gorgeous in my mind, and it's a result of how the author described things. And then Belladonna, I think that this author is fantastic at descriptions. I thought she was great in All the Stars and Teeth. I thought the way she described things there was great, just very imaginative. And then in Belladonna, which is very different from All the Stars and Teeth, once again, I thought that the descriptions, were fantastic. So both of those are winners for descriptions. And then we have pacing, and I have two answers for this. The main one would be Amari and the Great Game. I consistently kept thinking when I first picked it up, it is so impressive how quickly this author is making me care about what's going on. It's impressive how quickly the stakes are established, how much I immediately am like, oh no, Amari. I'm just worried for her. And also it did have that throughout the whole time. I wanted to keep going, because I wanted to know what was going to happen next. And then I also think Monsters We Defy had great pacing, especially, and I should say specifically, because the way that each of the characters in this heist-like story is introduced, you almost get like a little mini short story about them. And so very quickly, the author's like, here is information about this character. And it was, one, very fitting of that heist feel. And second, it makes you care about the characters so quickly, immediately. And so I think that that's really impressive and deserves to be noted under pacing as well. Next, I have the unique factor. So The Bone Orchard absolutely wins. The Bone Orchard is one that when I first read it, I was like, that was good, but it's just so weird, and it was so difficult to get into, and it's kind of trippy. And then, I don't know, the more I've sat on it, the more I'm like, yeah, but I kind of liked that about it. And it's not going to be for everybody. It's a very specific cup of tea, but it's one where I'm like, maybe it's like you just need to let it settle. I don't know. I kind of think at some point I might try The Bone Orchard again, because it really was very unique and different. And then last, I have guilty pleasure. So I don't love this term because of how it typically is used, but the way I mean it in this context is to have something that you almost feel like, oh, this isn't for me, but you want to read it anyway, and it just makes you happy, and you're like, I don't care what anybody thinks. And so I think the best way to describe this is, have you ever gone to a restaurant as, an adult, and you're looking at the menu and you're like, none of this sounds good. It's all too fancy, or it's all too just, I don't know, it just doesn't sound good. And then you look at the kids menu and you're like, this all of the meals here sound better. Can I just get like a happy face set of pancakes? Because that sounds better than everything else. So that is my definition of guilty pleasure, where you're like, everybody else in this restaurant can have their fancy food. I just want the cute little pancakes. So the books that fit for this would be The Ballad of Never After, which is a sequel to Once Upon a Broken Heart. It's ridiculous. It's super over the top. It's very self-aware of all of the ridiculous tropes that it is using and embracing and really leaning into. And I ate it up. I just thought it was so fun. And then This Vicious Grace. It has fun banter. It actually has some, you feel bad for the main character because the stakes are quite high and she's trying her best and people are trying to assassinate her and she just doesn't know who she can trust. So there's stakes there, but at the same time, like, the banter between her and the love interest is really sweet and cute and fun. And they kind of butt heads, but they push each other and they clearly care about each other and they help each other open up. And I just really liked it. I thought it was very, very fun. And that concludes the Perfect Book Challenge 2022 New Fantasy Releases Edition. And let me know for any of these listed. You don't have to do the same thing where you just talk about new fantasy. You can talk about books that you read this year. You, of course, don't have to list every single one, but if there's a book that you think of immediately for any of these prompts, feel free to let me know. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.